40% of the human DNA recovered from the Shroud of Turin traces back to Indian genetic lineages, according to the first full genomic sequencing ever run on official samples from the cloth. Samples that had been sitting untested since they were collected in 1978. That is not a finding about who was wrapped in the shroud. It is a finding about who touched it, breathed near it, and handled it somewhere along a centuries-long journey researchers are only now able to partially trace through genetics. An international team including Professor Noemi Procopio ran next-generation metagenomic sequencing, a method sensitive enough to detect trace genetic material from skin cells, microbes, and food particles left behind on fabric. This story covers what the DNA sequencing actually found, why it says nothing about the shroud's authenticity or age, and what earlier scientific testing already settled about how old this cloth really is. Researchers used PCR-free next-generation metagenomic sequencing, a genetic testing method that reads DNA fragments directly without the amplification step older tests relied on, which matters because amplification can introduce contamination and bias toward whichever DNA happens to copy most easily. Applied to samples collected from the shroud back in 1978. This method recovered diverse human mitochondrial lineages alongside skin-associated microbes, fungi, and salt-loving microorganisms called halophilic archaea, the kind that thrive in extremely salty environments similar to the Dead Sea. Beyond human and microbial traces, the sequencing also picked up DNA from Mediterranean red coral and a wide range of food and animal sources: cultivated wheat, carrots, corn, bananas, and peanuts, alongside genetic traces from cattle, pigs, chickens, dogs, and cats. Taken together, this reads less like the residue of a single event and more like the layered evidence of a well-traveled piece of fabric that passed through many hands, meals, and environments over a long stretch of time. Here is the distinction the coverage of this study keeps blurring. This genetic data reconstructs a history of contact, handling, and environment, meaning where the cloth likely traveled and who came near it. But it cannot date the fabric itself or confirm anything about its original use. The presence of Indian and Middle Eastern human genetic lineages, alongside Mediterranean coral and Dead Sea-type salt organisms, is consistent with a well-traveled trade route through those regions. But consistent with is not the same as proof of a specific route or century. The food and animal DNA most likely reflects centuries of routine handling, storage, and possibly ceremonial use, rather than any single dramatic event connected to the cloth's original creation. None of this new biological data addresses the question most people actually care about when they hear the name Shroud of Turin, which is a separate line of scientific evidence entirely, one that already exists from decades-old testing. The number most people actually want answered here is the shroud's age. And that question was already tested directly in 1988, when radiocarbon dating placed the linen itself in the medieval period with 95% confidence. Centuries after the historical period some believers associate it with. This new 2026 DNA study does not revisit, retest, or overturn that carbon dating result in any way. It is a completely different kind of test measuring completely different material, genetic residue rather than the age of the linen fibers themselves. Some outlets covering this story have implied the DNA findings add mystery back into the shroud's authenticity, when the more accurate framing is that the DNA results in the age question are simply unrelated lines of evidence answering different questions. This is a story about biological history layered onto a cloth, not new evidence one way or another on the debate over its origin. Quick recap. The first full genomic sequencing of official 1978 Shroud of Turin samples found 40% of human DNA traces to Indian lineages, alongside Middle Eastern genetics, food and animal DNA, and salt-loving microbes, evidence of a well-traveled and much-handled piece of fabric. So, signal or noise? Signal, with an important boundary. The sequencing itself is real, peer-reviewed, and methodologically sound, published in scientific reports using genuinely improved techniques over anything available in 1978. But treat any claim that this DNA study reopens the authenticity debate as noise. The 1988 radiocarbon dating already placed the cloth in the medieval period. And this new biological data does not revisit that finding at all. The honest read is a fascinating travel history layered onto an already dated object. Nothing more, nothing less. Subscribe for the history stories that separate what new evidence actually proves from what headlines want it to mean. Signal from the noise. Every week.